The true origin of the British Empire's collapse. What historians get wrong. Here is a paradox most people never notice. The British Empire was at its largest not when it was strongest, but at the exact moment the system underneath it had already begun to fail. It ruled a quarter of the planet while quietly losing control of the one thing that had made all of it possible: money. Most people think they know when the empire began to collapse. Some point to 1947, when India became independent. Others choose 1956, when the Suez Crisis exposed Britain's weakness. A few go back to the Second World War and say the empire exhausted itself defeating Hitler. Each moment mattered, but none was the beginning. And the force that finally brought the empire down was not an enemy army. It was a rival that could win without firing a shot, simply by controlling the money. The British Empire reached its greatest territorial extent after the First World War. At its peak, it ruled roughly a quarter of the world's land and more than 400 million people. On a map, it looked untouchable. British warships crossed every ocean, London financed trade, and the pound was trusted worldwide. And yet this was the paradox. The empire was largest at the exact moment the system underneath it had started to fail. So what broke first? The colonies, the navy, the economy, or something less visible? The financial machinery that allowed a small island to control territories, armies, markets, and governments overseas. Why did a country that won two world wars emerge from both weaker? And why could Washington eventually force London to retreat without firing a shot? To understand the collapse, stop thinking of the empire as a collection of flags. It was a system built on industrial supremacy, naval dominance, global finance, and the ability to make the empire pay for imperial rule. In the 19th century, Britain manufactured the textiles, rails, ships, machines, and weapons much of the world wanted. The Royal Navy protected the routes. London's banks financed trade, insurers protected cargoes, and sterling settled accounts. Conquest was expensive, but financial control could make it pay for itself. India was the clearest example. Indian taxes funded colonial administration. Indian soldiers fought in British campaigns from Africa to Asia. Indian revenues supported the army, ports, railways, and bureaucracy that kept the subcontinent under British rule. The empire extracted money, labor, soldiers, and raw materials, then used them to preserve that structure. Britain did not need a British soldier in every village. It ruled through local elites, colonial officials, commercial monopolies, naval pressure, and credit. Institutions that looked administrative or financial reinforced political control. For decades, the model worked because Britain stood at the world economy's center. But empires rarely begin collapsing when they look weak. They begin collapsing when their costs keep rising after their advantages start disappearing. By the late 19th century, two challengers were moving faster. The United States had a continental market, vast resources, and factories operating on a scale Britain struggled to match. Germany, unified in 1871, built powerful chemical, electrical, steel, and engineering industries. Both learned from Britain and built newer systems around those lessons. Britain remained rich. London remained the world's financial capital. The empire kept expanding, but the source of British wealth was changing. More income came from overseas investments, shipping, insurance, and finance, while competitors captured a growing share of modern industry. The danger was hidden by the symbols of power. The Navy was enormous, the pound respected, and British capital financed projects worldwide. Yet underneath was the widening separation. Britain increasingly controlled the money moving through the global system without preserving the same lead in producing the goods that gave that money strength. That did not destroy the empire overnight. It made the empire more dependent on confidence, credit, and uninterrupted trade. And in August 1914, all three were about to be tested at once. In 1851, Britain invited the world into the Crystal Palace and displayed what looked like the future itself. Steam engines, locomotives, machine tools, textiles, the message was clear. Britain did not merely trade with the world, Britain manufactured it. British coal-powered factories, British iron built railways from India to Argentina. British shipyards launched the vessels that carried commerce and empire. London supplied the credit, the Royal Navy protected the routes, and British manufacturers filled the cargo holds. But the exhibition hit a warning. Foreign visitors were not only admiring British machines, they were studying them. The United States had something Britain could never create at home: continental scale. It possessed vast reserves of coal, iron, oil, timber, and fertile land, along with a rapidly expanding market. Its population rose from about 31 million in 1860 to more than 76 million in 1900. American firms could build larger factories, standardize production, and sell to millions of consumers. Then came Germany. Unified in 1871, it built an industrial system around technical education, scientific research, powerful banks, and closely connected corporations. Krupp, Siemens, BASF, and Bayer were not simply copying Britain. They were moving into chemicals, electrical engineering, advanced steel, and industrial research. The balance shifted quickly. Around 1870, Britain produced roughly one-third of the world's manufactured goods. By 1913, its share had fallen to about 14%. The United States had become the largest industrial economy, while Germany had moved ahead of Britain in several critical industries. Britain was not producing less than before. Its rivals were producing much faster. Decline does not always look like contraction. Sometimes it looks like continued growth, while old commitments become harder to support. Britain compensated through finance. London remained the center of global credit. British investors owned railways, mines, plantations, utilities, and government bonds worldwide. Interest, shipping income, insurance, and overseas dividends helped cover the country's trade deficit. A railway in Brazil could be financed in London, insured through Lloyd's, paid for in sterling, and partly owned by British investors. The system was profitable. It also created an illusion. Wealth accumulated during Britain's rise concealed the erosion of its industrial lead. Meanwhile, the empire kept adding obligations. Every port required protection. Every sea route required ships. Every colonial crisis demanded troops or money. The naval race with Germany made the burden heavier, as Admiral Alfred von Tirpitz built a fleet to challenge Britain in the North Sea. The Boer War offered a warning. Between 1899 and 1902, Britain needed hundreds of thousands of troops to defeat two small settler republics in southern Africa. London won, but the conflict lasted longer, cost more, and exposed more weakness than planners expected. Still, the empire looked secure. The pound remained trusted. British ships crossed every ocean. London financed governments worldwide. The map kept expanding, and maps are persuasive. But maps do not show industrial shares, financial exposure, or dependence on imported food and raw materials. They do not show what happens when trade stops and credit tightens. By 1914, Britain was still the banker of the world, but no longer its uncontested workshop. Then Sarajevo triggered a war Britain expected to finance through the machinery of empire. Instead, the war would consume that machinery and move the center of global credit from London to New York. When war came in August 1914, Britain controlled the world's largest merchant fleet, the leading financial center, and an empire able to supply soldiers, food, metals, and taxes from across the globe. London believed this network would allow Britain to outlast Germany. At first it did. British banks financed Allied purchases. The Royal Navy blockaded German trade. Troops came from Canada, Australia, Africa, and India. But industrial war consumed money faster than the empire could replace it. Britain needed American wheat, steel, machinery, explosives, and weapons, on a scale domestic production could not meet. Those purchases required dollars. London sold American securities accumulated over decades. When those assets ran out, it borrowed. Before 1914, British capital flowed outward. During the war, money increasingly flowed from New York to London. J.P. Morgan became the purchasing agent for Britain and France. American banks were now financing Britain's survival. The change was disguised as victory. Germany was defeated. Britain received new mandates in Iraq, Palestine, and Africa. On the map, the empire had never been larger. On the balance sheet, it had never been more exposed. Britain emerged owing billions to the United States. It had sold overseas assets, lost markets, and sacrificed a generation of workers. Yet the government tried to restore the system as if the war had been temporary. That decision centered on the pound. Before 1914, sterling had been convertible into gold at a fixed rate. Restoring that promise became a symbol of recovery. Bankers wanted the pound to regain its prestige, and politicians wanted proof that London still ruled finance. In 1925, Chancellor Winston Churchill returned sterling to gold at its pre-war parity. The move looked strong. Economically, it was punishing. The pound was valued too highly for Britain's weakened industry. Exports became more expensive. Coal, steel, textiles, and shipbuilding came under pressure. Employers demanded lower wages while workers absorbed the cost of restoring financial prestige. The conflict erupted in the general strike of 1926, when millions stopped work in support of coal miners resisting wage cuts and longer hours. The strike failed, but it exposed the mechanism. Sterling's credibility was being defended by forcing adjustment onto industry and labor. Colonial control was becoming harder, too. In India, the Amritsar massacre of 1919 shattered claims that British rule rested on law and reform. Gandhi turned resistance into a mass movement. In Ireland, Egypt, Iraq, and elsewhere, populations that had heard Britain speak of wartime freedom demanded it for themselves. The empire was being squeezed from both directions. Abroad, subject peoples demanded sovereignty. At home, the economy struggled to finance the image of a superpower. Then the global crisis arrived. In September 1931, after panic and a run on sterling, Britain abandoned the gold standard. The decision limited deeper damage, but the symbolism was devastating. The promise anchoring British finance could no longer be defended. London responded by building a protected sterling area, tying colonies and partner economies more closely to the pound. It preserved influence, but this was defensive power now, a wall around a shrinking advantage. By 1939, Britain still possessed the world's largest empire. But its colonies were more restless, its industry less dominant, and its currency survived through managed dependence rather than unquestioned supremacy. The next war would reveal whether Britain still controlled the empire or whether the empire had become the last asset Britain could spend. When the Second World War began in September 1939, Britain still looked like a global superpower. It controlled an empire, commanded a vast fleet, and drew resources from across the world. But beneath that reach was a dangerous fact. Britain could not fight an industrial war alone. Modern war required oil, aircraft, trucks, aluminum, machine tools, food, and ammunition in quantities no empire had consumed before. Much of it came from the United States, and Washington expected payment in dollars. At first, Britain paid cash. London sold gold and liquidated investments built up over generations. By 1940, the empire was defending itself by spending the financial inheritance that had made it dominant. Then came the Destroyers for Bases Agreement. The United States transferred 50 aging destroyers in exchange for access to British Atlantic bases. It helped Britain survive, but assistance now came with strategic concessions. Lend-Lease followed in March 1941. Roosevelt presented it as lending a hose to a neighbor whose house was burning. In practice, it let Britain receive weapons and supplies without immediate payment. But the hose came with conditions. Before the aid was approved, Washington required Britain to open its books and prove it had genuinely run out of money, and even to sell one of its most valuable holdings on American soil, the American Vice Coast Corporation, in a rushed, forced sale for a fraction of its worth. Then, in the Master Lend-Lease Agreement of 1942, came Article 7, a commitment to dismantle discriminatory trade after the war. The language sounded idealistic, but it was aimed directly at imperial preference, the tariff system that bound the empire into a single economic bloc. The aid keeping Britain alive was also being used to pry open the empire's closed markets. It was indispensable. It was also proof that the empire could no longer finance its own defense, and that its ally intended to charge for the rescue in imperial coin. Britain found another source of credit inside the empire. When India, Egypt, and other territories supplied troops, goods, and services, London often paid through sterling accounts rather than scarce dollars. These balances became promises Britain would settle after the war. India became one of Britain's largest creditors. Indian taxes, factories, farmers, and more than 2 million soldiers supported the Allied effort. Yet much of what Britain owed India could not be freely converted. The empire was borrowing from the people it ruled to preserve the system ruling them. That contradiction had political consequences. In 1942, the Quit India movement demanded an end to British rule. Its leaders were arrested, but repression could not restore legitimacy. The war had mobilized millions of Indians while proving that Britain depended on them. And before Germany was defeated, the United States was designing the financial order that would replace Britain's. In July 1944, delegates from 44 countries gathered at Bretton Woods. Britain sent John Maynard Keynes. He proposed an international currency called the Bancor and a system that would discipline debtor nations and countries accumulating large surpluses. The American negotiator Harry Dexter White wanted the dollar at the center. Other currencies would be linked to it, while the dollar would be convertible into gold at $35 an ounce. The International Monetary Fund and World Bank would operate inside a structure shaped by American power. Keynes had the reputation. White had the money. The American plan won. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, Washington ended Lend-Lease. Britain had won the war, but its exports were weakened, its obligations enormous, and its dollar reserves disappearing. London requested help. The result was a $3.75 billion American loan, tied to conditions pushing Britain towards sterling convertibility. When convertibility began in July 1947, holders of sterling rushed to exchange it for dollars. The reserves needed for food and fuel drained so quickly that the experiment was suspended after only weeks. This was more than a currency crisis. It revealed the new hierarchy. Britain still had warships, bases, and colonies, but the country that financed the war now controlled the currency, credit, and institutions of the peace. And in the same summer that sterling failed its test, British rule in India came to an end. On August 15, 1947, British rule in India formally ended. The event is often presented as a dignified transfer of power, a tired empire recognizing that history had moved on. That version is incomplete. Britain did not leave simply because its leaders had become more democratic. And it did not leave only because the treasury was empty. Independence came from the collision of two forces: decades of organized Indian resistance and Britain's collapsing ability to suppress it at an acceptable cost. India was not just another colony. It was the central mechanism of British power in Asia. Indian taxes had financed colonial administration. Indian troops had fought British wars from Sudan to Burma. Indian ports connected the Mediterranean, the Persian Gulf, and Southeast Asia. The subcontinent supplied manpower, raw materials, and a vast protected market for British goods. Losing India meant losing much more than territory. It meant losing the army, revenue, and strategic depth that helped Britain control everything around it. By the end of the Second World War, the political foundation of that control was breaking. The Quit India movement had been crushed through arrests and force, but repression did not restore obedience. More than 2 million Indians had served in the wartime army. They returned to a country that had been asked to defend freedom abroad while being denied it at home. The trials of officers from the Indian National Army triggered public anger. In February 1946, sailors in the Royal Indian Navy mutinied in Bombay and other ports. The rebellion was contained, but the message was alarming. Britain could no longer assume that Indian forces would always enforce British rule. That changed the calculation in London. An empire can survive protests if its army remains loyal. It can survive financial weakness if local institutions continue obeying. But when both money and obedience become uncertain, control becomes dangerously expensive. Prime Minister Clement Attlee's government also faced a crisis at home. Britain needed food, housing, exports, and dollars. The public expected a welfare state after 6 years of sacrifice. Every soldier and administrator required overseas was one less resource available for reconstruction. Britain could attempt to hold India, but doing so might require a massive military occupation, financed with money the country did not possess, and carried out by forces whose reliability could no longer be guaranteed. So London accelerated its departure. The exit was not orderly. British India was divided into India and Pakistan. Borders were drawn at extraordinary speed. Millions crossed them amid communal violence, and hundreds of thousands were killed. The empire left, but the human cost of the structure it had built did not leave with it. And once India was gone, the weakness of the wider imperial system became harder to hide. Burma and Ceylon gained independence in 1948. Nationalist movements intensified across Africa, the Middle East, and Southeast Asia. Yet Britain did not immediately abandon imperial power. It fought a long emergency in Malaya. It crushed the Mau Mau rebellion in Kenya. It maintained bases, protected oil routes, and tried to preserve strategic control even where direct colonial rule was becoming politically impossible. This matters because decolonization was not one sudden moral awakening. British leaders calculated which territories remained valuable, which could still be controlled, and how much force each would require. Then, in 1956, that calculation failed in public. Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal, the route connecting Europe to Asian trade and Middle Eastern oil. For Britain, the canal was not merely infrastructure. It was a symbol of the old system. British finance, naval power, and strategic access working together. Britain and France secretly coordinated with Israel. Israel would invade Egypt. Britain and France would issue an ultimatum, then intervene under the pretext of separating the forces and protecting the canal. Militarily, the operation advanced. Politically, it collapsed. The United States opposed the invasion. President Dwight Eisenhower feared it would strengthen Soviet influence, damage Western credibility, and destabilize the Middle East. More importantly, Washington controlled the financial support Britain needed. And Washington did not merely withhold help, it reached for the financial weapon directly. The United States blocked Britain's access to roughly $561 million in International Monetary Fund, standby credit, and around $600 million in credit from the Export-Import Bank. Most devastating of all, it threatened to dump its own holdings of British government sterling bonds, a move that would have sent the pound into free fall. As the pressure mounted, investors sold sterling and Britain's reserves drained away. The government needed American assistance and IMF resources to defend the currency, but Washington made its position explicit: no support until Britain agreed to a ceasefire and withdrawal. For the first time in modern history, a great power was brought to its knees not by force of arms, but by the threat of a run on its currency. The Royal Navy could move ships. British aircraft could strike targets. British soldiers could seize ground. But London could not defend the pound without American cooperation. That was the real meaning of Suez. The crisis did not destroy the British Empire. It exposed that the destruction had already happened beneath the surface. Britain still possessed the instruments of a great power. It no longer possessed the financial independence to use them against the wishes of the United States. The troops withdrew. Prime Minister Anthony Eden resigned weeks later. and the world understood what the map had concealed. Britain was no longer the nation setting the limits of Western power. It was now operating inside limits set in Washington. After Suez, the British Empire did not vanish. It changed speed. In 1957, Ghana became the first sub-Saharan African colony to gain independence from British rule. 3 years later, Prime Minister Harold Macmillan spoke of a wind of change moving across Africa. He was admitting that direct rule had become too expensive and too difficult to defend. During the 1960s, British flags came down across Africa and the Caribbean. Nigeria became independent in 1960. Kenya followed in 1963. Then, in 1968, Britain announced plans to reduce its major military commitments east of Suez. The retreat now included the bases and sea routes that had once made the empire global. Yet Britain did not become powerless. The Commonwealth preserved diplomatic ties. The City of London remained a major financial center. Britain kept nuclear weapons, a permanent seat on the United Nations Security Council, and Five Eyes intelligence ties. The old structure was not simply destroyed. Parts of it were converted. Colonies became sovereign states, but currencies, military agreements, and financial relationships did not disappear overnight. The handover of Hong Kong to China in 1997 became the final image of territorial retreat. But the decisive transfer had happened decades earlier. The pound had lost its position to the dollar. The Royal Navy had lost global primacy to the United States Navy. London still mattered, but it no longer wrote the rules alone. So why did the largest empire in modern history collapse? First, Britain lost its industrial lead. The empire had been built when British factories and shipyards dominated world production. By the 20th century, the United States and Germany had overtaken that model in scale and technology. Second, 2 world wars reversed Britain's financial position. The country that once financed governments across the world sold assets, accumulated debt, and became dependent on American credit. Third, colonial resistance destroyed the efficiency of imperial rule. National movements turned occupation into a struggle over legitimacy and military loyalty. A system maintained with limited British manpower now faced populations organized to make it unworkable. Fourth, the United States built a new order around the dollar, American security guarantees, and institutions centered in Washington. That system did not need the old European empires. Together, these forces broke the mechanism that had made empire possible. Britain did not lose its empire because of one prime minister, one colony, or one humiliating crisis. It fell because its industrial base, financial power, military commitments, and political legitimacy stopped reinforcing one another. For years, the map concealed that fact. Britain still had ships, bases, flags, and ceremonies, but the system beneath them had changed. The lesson reaches beyond Britain. Great powers decline when the cost of maintaining their definition of power rises faster than the economic system supporting it. Military reach can hide that imbalance. Reserve currencies can delay it, but neither can erase it forever. The British Empire did not collapse when the final flag came down. It collapsed when Britain could no longer finance its own definition of power, and the country financing it gained the power to say no. If this video changed how you see the British Empire, like the video and subscribe for more documentaries about the hidden systems behind money, power, and political control. Then tell us in the comments, what mattered most? Colonial resistance, Britain's war debts, or America's control of the post-war financial system?